Hello, and welcome to part two of our interview with Michael Shortt, video game and IP law specialist, partner at Fasken's Montreal offices, and a great interviewee. Part two continues with a load of insights into contract law, the changing world of it, and advice for indies. So I'll get out of the way and let the interview continue. And even so, on that about negotiating and be able to move it, and you're saying how milestones are very much able to be moved. Is there any parts that you found that they really won't change? Because in your talk, you talk about, basically go in with the idea that everything's negotiable and clarify everything and change what you want to change. Um, how is it? Have you ever had instances where publishers just outright refuse to change certain parts? Are there sections that are just no-goes?
Totally. So in my the talk, one of the points I made is a publisher may send you a PDF or may send you sort of what they often call like the business terms, which sort of one page where they're trying to say this part's negotiable, but the rest are general terms and conditions. We don't change those, or they may not even say. They may just sort of hint that like really focus on the first two pages and they'll leave the rest alone. And the point is not that you can get changes everywhere, but that you should read the whole thing and think about every piece and whether you'd want to change that and what you would change. And often part of negotiation is you ask for a bunch of things, some of which you'll get, some of which will be flagged for more discussion, some of which will be refused outright. And then it's a question of sort of feeling out what kind of bargaining power you have. Are there other publishers that you can play off against each other if you're on the developer side? And if you're the publisher, asking yourself, how much do I want this game? And how much do I think that they really are going to insist on this particular change? And that actually goes both ways. Really, it's a question of typically the publisher has more negotiating power in an indie relationship because they've got the money, and the person who's spending money on a project typically has the most sway. So, in my role as sort of a developer side lawyer, it's asking for a lot, knowing I'm not going to get everything. And there's things we're going to have to tell the client, like, look, they've said no to these 8 things. Pick 2 you really want, and we can go back and think about. And by the way, these, if of the 2, probably you won't be able to get A and B, so maybe focus on C through G. And that's always a dance you do in any kind of contract negotiation. It's a little bit like some, and you also know that some things may be easier to negotiate than others. If you go to buy a car, price is up for grabs, what model you're going to get. But then there's a lot of things the salesperson just doesn't have the authority to modify. Like the warranty may be standard from the manufacturer, so try and negotiate that warranty just doesn't make sense. And so often when you go into these kinds of deals, that's the same thing. There's things that no publisher is never going to give you, and that may or may not be important to you. If they are, you may have a problem, but in other cases, they may be just nice to haves, and you're just not going to get that. So it's just about realizing that you're not going to be able to do so. And the other thing you can do is sometimes, even if you can't get, if there's a clause you find problematic and they're not going to take it out, you may be able to water it down or come up with some sort of creative compromise. I had a case where our client was really interested in was protecting the background technology. So they had a sort of an engine that they were using across multiple games, and they were publishing one game with the publisher. And the publisher said, "Look, I want access to the source code for your engine." And my client said, "You don't need that. I don't want to give you that. This is my secret sauce. It's used in multiple games. I'm coming to you to publish one game. I'm not coming to you to sell you my background tool." And so they pointed out rightly that, like, look, we need source code for the engine if ever we're going to take over development of the game. Like if you die, if you go bankrupt. So there was a legitimate concern on both sides. And the way you split a difference like that is typically to say, we'll put the source code in escrow. So if we do go bankrupt, we do die, you have the power, publisher, to go to the escrow agent and say, here's what happened, here's our contract, please give me the source code. And under those strict conditions, you can get access to it, and then you can use it as you need to. And so that was something where they weren't going to take it out, but what we were able to do was come up with a middle ground that was neither of the extreme positions. And depending on, this is always super case by case, but depending on what someone wants, the solution may not be sort of a yes, no, it may be yes, but, or no, but, and you try to figure out what the but is going to be that keeps both parties happy.
That's fascinating. Yeah, and you talked a lot actually about the source code in your talk as well. I thought that was a really interesting point. That it's one of those things that you can easily kind of not think about too deeply, but giving someone your source code is giving them everything.
From a security perspective, from a negotiating power perspective, there's a lot of developers are rightly quite they keep their source code as in limited circulation as possible. That's why porting, one of the things, the person who's doing the port needs access to your source code. So you want to think carefully about whether the ports are going to be developed primarily by you or primarily by someone else, just because that also has an impact on, as a developer, who has access to your source code. If you can do them in-house, then it's no one except you. If you don't have the resources to do ports in-house, then obviously some third party, typically chosen by the publisher, is going to have access to that. And it's not like source code is leaking all the time, so it's not like ports is inherently dangerous. But just if you're someone who just wants to always know where the copies of your source code are, then ports is something that has implications for that, and you'll want to think about it differently than if you're not so concerned about that kind of thing.
Yeah, totally. But and as you say, it doesn't happen all the time, but it's such big news when it does happen, when a game source code goes out, because, and especially, you think about the amount of multiplayer games now, or games that even just have multiplayer components, and that's done. The second you've leaked that out,
Yeah,
that is hacked for the rest of its life.
yeah. That and even games where there hasn't been a leak, there are just some really disturbingly creative cheats that are available online, and that's always a whack-a-mole operation where going after wrongdoers on the internet, you'll never finish whacking all the moles, and so you need to, as much as you can, prevent anything from going online in the first place, because if hackers are able to come up with cheats and sell those cheats online, even without access to source code, just imagine what would happen if that source code did become available.
Totally, and it's so interesting. I was watching a documentary recently, and they were talking about the guys that originally hacked Atari machines, and then you think about Game Sharks and this, and on the early sort
Yeah.
of 3D consoles, and how different that was to now, and how different what that you got out of that.
Yeah, no, and the things have just gotten things. It's one of these arms races where security is getting tighter and tighter, but then people who are on the other side trying to get in are also constantly improving their tools. And much like just any kind of IT security scenario, you've got both sides. Just the red and blue sides are constantly improving their own techniques. And unfortunately, much like a shark, you got to constantly keep moving to just be in the game. If you stop, you're going to die. And unfortunately, that's a moving target. Everyone's on the security treadmill, and I don't think it'll ever stop.
No, absolutely. Yeah, it feels like it's constant. There's things being installed, or this even the same game that you'll go back and play it after 6 months of not playing it, and suddenly it's got another level of anti-cheat software. You're having to install something new, and it's
Yeah.
whether that's because of a leak or just even like another game that publishers worked on has had an issue, and they go, right, well, everything gets lifted now.
Yeah, well, and that's something we often see in a lot of contracts is a clause that says, developer will add in software chosen by the publisher. And there's nothing wrong with that. And you just pointed out a really good example of one of my other games was hacked. I want to make sure this doesn't happen to you. Please put this in. And that's just something that it makes a lot of sense. And everyone just needs to understand why those clauses are there and to think about just resource implications. Is it easy to put this stuff in, or is it hard? And if it's hard, there should probably be some kind of payment to the developer just to make sure that the resources they put in are being paid for on some level. So again, that's a good example of something where both sides have legitimate expectations about, we need to put this in. Well, I want to be paid for doing it. So how can we make sure that everyone's happy one way or another?
And I guess that actually ties well into the next question, which is kind of about advice for indies looking at legalese in contracts and how they
Mhm.
deal with it. You could look at it and think you have to learn everything yourself, and you should. I guess you should try and know as much as you can, but realistically, you're a game developer. You do not have the time to be a lawyer as well. Well,
Yeah,
for the most part, I imagine.
yeah. Well, and that's one of the challenges of being any kind of small business owner, is that you're often expected to know so many things, or you'll be faced with challenges from many, many different fields. And it's not like you're the CEO of a large company who can just hand something over to a specialist who's been working at your company for 5 years, knows your business as well as you do, but also is a specialist in that area. So being the head of a small studio, you need to know a whole bunch of accounting. You need to know taxes. You need to know some legal stuff. You got to have a general idea about HR and employment issues to make sure that you're running your team effectively and in compliance with all the legal requirements. You need to know a huge number of things. And one of the advantages of hiring a lawyer is you've hired someone who knows those things for you. And if they're good, they'll be able to explain it to you in a way you understand. If they're really good, they'll know not just the law, but also your business. Because a lot of these contracts, yes, there's legal things that, to a certain extent, any lawyer who's specialized in that, say, intellectual property could give you good advice on. But there's other clauses that aren't so much legal problems as they are economic ones. Like, what is the right rev share split if the publisher is just doing marketing and isn't actually financing your game? What's market for that? That's not a legal question. That's basically what a video game industry question. Like, do you know what the typical split is? So and you want to think about, do I need a lawyer? And if I do, how do I pick that lawyer? And it's going to depend on a couple of things. You want to think about what is the law applicable to the contract. Like if you're dealing with, say, a Chinese publisher and the contract's going to be under Chinese law, even if they're doing it in English to accommodate you, you still want to have a Chinese lawyer look at that. You want to make sure that if you hire someone from outside that jurisdiction, they may or may not be able to advise you on the intricacies of Chinese law. You also want to think about, does the person know things about the video game industry? If you're very confident about your own negotiating abilities, you have a sense of what's market, you may not need a lawyer who knows the economics or the business side. That may be your bailiwick, and all you need is them to advise on the legalese. But if this is your first publishing deal, or you've only done one or two before, you may want someone who has both the business knowledge and the legal knowledge. And so you want to think about what you need. And then in terms of costs, that's obviously something you want to discuss. Make sure that the lawyer's fees are proportionate to the amount of money you think you're going to make out of this. But one of the advantages of hiring a lawyer at this stage is that if you are about to sign a publishing deal, you're about to get a big injection of cash. You can even build in the anticipated legal fees to the budget you get to the publisher, and make sure you get paid some amount on signing. Most contracts these days include some amount on the day of signature, or within a week or 10 days or whatever, just to get the payments made. And then that can be put towards your legal costs, because the publisher is aware you're going to have startup costs for your game. You're going to have costs that may be related to the agreement itself, like buying certain tools or tech that are required, or in this case, just hiring a lawyer. So you can make sure, the advantage of a publishing contract is you can make sure your needs and your resources match up, because you can build that into your budget. And I don't think a publisher's going to, you don't necessarily even have to tell the publisher that, say like, oh, we've budgeted this amount for our lawyer. Just make sure that whatever that initial signing bonus is, or that signature milestone, just make sure that covers the expected legal costs and anything else that you need the money for in the short run. A good example is like, if you know it's going to trigger a need for an accountant, again, build that in. Like, there's no reason why you can't, when you develop your budget shouldn't be limited to just what you need to build the game. If you've got, if you're renting an office, you obviously have to build that into the budget that you're using, that you're giving to the publisher. Build other costs in, like legal costs. It's common sense to me that you do that. So it is an expense. And if for whatever reason you don't have access to a lawyer, then I'd say, YouTube videos and videos like this one are a great place to start. Like, people who have been in the industry talking about specific cases, or even if it's a hypothetical case, like a really detailed one, can be useful. The other thing is articles by reputable firms, whether those are law firms or accounting firms, or developers who are sharing or publishers who are sharing their experiences. Like GDC Vault has a lot of really interesting talks on this topic. And I think ECI Games, this is supposed to be the first of a series. I suspect many of the others in this series are going to be helpful. So learn from other people's experience to the extent that you can. But if you can afford a specialist, try to get that. And especially, it's something you can build into the contract itself, which is great. Not every time you need a lawyer will it be associated with a payoff that can help pay for the lawyer. And this is one of those times, fortunately enough.
Yeah, that's a definite bonus of the situation. And yeah, and it's also that being able to hire someone to do it it's that peace of mind as well, right? That it's not just now on you to know it. Even if you know it all as still as the head of a business, that's a lot to take on yourself as well. Um, and you mentioned about rev share, and rev share is obviously a really interesting thing that people love to talk about with games. I think it's a lot of indies' first thing, because it sounds like, oh, I can get money early, and things like that. Has rev share changed at all over the kind of the last 10 years of indie? Or
So I'd say rev share basis is probably the most common type of indie contract, in the sense that publisher puts up money to fund the game, or if the game is already ready, may just be handling the marketing. And then as the money comes in, it gets split into two streams between the developer and the publisher. That is by far the most common model. I think that's essentially what distinguishes an indie model from the more traditional publishing, which was, I pay you to make the game, you give me the IP, then I run off and do whatever I want with it. And you don't see a penny more because it's my IP. That's sort of the traditional AAA. AAA may not be the right label there, but that was the old model of, I pay you to make something, but I own it, and then you're expected to make your profit out of what I pay you to make the game. The indie model is really, you retain ownership of your IP, you license it to the publisher, and then the publisher, in exchange for that license, pays you a percentage of what comes in. And that percentage tends to be extremely case by case. There's market tendencies, but it varies by publisher. It varies by type of game. We talked about sequels being a good example, where if you're a developer who had a successful first game, the sequel should give you better rev share than the first one, just because once you've got that built-in audience, the sequel is likely to make more money. It's less risky for the publisher, and so more of the money should go to you, because the publisher can be more certain that they're going to make their initial investment back. And so rev share is almost a guarantee in these kinds of contracts. The real question is going to be just what is the formula to work that out.
I mean, is there any change in the amount of reps? I know you were saying actually earlier on that it comes in earlier now, and that kind of, I guess, is a slightly maybe increased trust and maybe a deeper understanding just of what indies need from those publishers.
And I'd say that's probably the big change that I've seen. The actual split tends to be too case by case to say that there's been a clear trend that could be applied industry wide, but more and more you're seeing pre-recoupment rev share. So before the publisher has made back all of its investment in the game, it used to be almost guaranteed you'd see nothing until they'd fully recouped. Now the developer is seeing some amount of rev share, and as I say, probably 10 to 20 is the range that I've seen. And it really, I mean, so it depends what the game is, depends your own track record. Also depends how many publishers are interested. If you've got multiple people competing to publish your game, you're going to be in a much better negotiating position with each one of them. That's the other negotiating strategy is publishers can rarely sort of say, well, I've got other games, so I'm going to give you a less good deal. That's just not a negotiating position that makes much sense, and it's also not one that is ever likely to really happen. Whereas on the other hand, if you're the developer who's got multiple publishers, that's an example where you can say, well, someone else is offering me this. Are you willing to do better? Are you willing to match that? And you can often sort of, if you've got a deal that you like, except for one aspect, sometimes as a developer, you're able to say, look, I like your contract, but there's this one piece that I have a problem with. This other publisher, often you can't name names, but you can say, someone is offering me a better version of that. Are you willing to change that? Because if you are, I'm very happy to sign with you. And that's sort of always the tug of war, where you're sort of, the analogy is you're dating multiple people at once, and very quickly you're going to have to choose which one you want to marry. But being in a position where you have multiple people competing to publish your game is a very different negotiating dynamic than when it's a one-on-one negotiation. I'd say the majority of the negotiations I do are one-on-one, and I can definitely tell the difference when it's not one publisher in the running, it's many.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I get so shop around a bit. Yeah, don't take the first offer and let them fight. I guess to an extent. Yeah.
If you can, I mean, sometimes you can't. Sometimes you're in sort of a niche, or your game is good, but no one's willing to take the risk. So if you can generate more interest, go for it, because that is the ideal situation to be in as a developer. And it's really just a question of whether you'll be able to get that.
That's interesting. Um, One of the things you mentioned that I found really interesting in your initial talk, we were going through all the contracts part by part. We talking about localized languages, and it's something that, of course, it would be in a contract. But before seeing your talk, I was like, I didn't really kind of appreciate that that's something baked in very early. Um, and obviously, we offer localization services, and it's something I wonder about is have you seen recently we've released two articles where it shows the kind of the growth of localized languages, and it's unbelievable. Things like Simplified Chinese went from being on 10% of games in the mid 2000s to being on 95% of games, major sort of releases now. Um, have has that grown as well within the publisher contracts? Are they really increasing the number of languages they expect?
So it tends to be a publisher side expense. That's one of the things that is seen as like the publisher's responsibility. Some will try to recoup those costs, particularly if they're using a third party to do the localization. If they're doing it in-house, it might be seen as sort of like publisher overhead, where we have a localization department, so we're not going to recoup that. But I would say almost always a publisher expense. Usually all the developer has to do is sort of provide the text files and then implement the right text files back to make sure the game can be localized correctly. The question of, I agree with the trend you've noticed, tends to be game specific to a certain extent for indies, just because if you're releasing something global, you're pretty sure it's going to be successful globally, so you need to have many languages. Indies, because it's more niche, you often have wait and see approach. There are some contracts that will say we'll figure out where we're localizing later. Others may commit to a minimum. Often it's sort of, here's what we're going to do right now, and later on we'll look at maybe expanding that list. I'd say if you're Quebec based, you're always going to localize into French because that's how you maximize your tax credits. So quite apart from whether you think you'll have a good audience in Quebec itself or in France or in sort of la francophonie, you're still going to do it in French because that gives you the best return on investment from a tax perspective. Like the cost of localizing in French will be far outweighed by the better tax treatment you're going to get. If you're outside of Quebec, obviously that sort of incentive may or may not exist in local law. Like I couldn't tell you whether in Brazil you're going to get a tax break for localizing in Portuguese, but that's the kind of thing where that's very specific to Quebec. Everything else tends to be more market driven. Do you think the game will be successful in a given market? I'd say it can also be driven by geopolitics. Like Russian localization has fallen off a cliff since the Ukraine. Chinese, it is far more common than it used to be.
Totally.
Um, if you ask me sort of, if you twist my arm and said, okay, what's the most common ones? I would agree. It's like French, German, Spanish, Italian, Japanese, Chinese, sometimes just simplified, sometimes both. And a little less common would be Korean. Not every game. I think it's one that often gets overlooked, frankly, even by some publishers. Um, As you go in Japan, I would say Korea is in some ways a similar level of market as you're already localizing to that area. There's some shared culture. I'm not here to tell people how to run their businesses, but that's one that I've seen, but not as frequently as Japanese and Chinese.
Yeah, it's really fascinating the way that Korean kind of pops up, but then randomly you would expect it to be on the same level because exactly the market's an incredibly strong market, and very video games focused. You know, obviously we all know. I mean, StarCraft and all this being the kind of the history of esports really is Korea, and it's fascinating that.
Yeah, that they basically invented esports, and yet Japan almost seems like a foregone conclusion in terms of localization, but Korea tends to be case by case, and I'm always a little surprised by that. I would expect them to almost always go together, but maybe there's some marketing studies that I'm not privy to that drives that distinction.
Totally. Um, yeah, no, it's fascinating. It's yeah, it's cool to see them expanding generally, and it's also like it's interesting what you say about the wait and see approach because it's localization is one of the few parts of a game where you can wait to see how well it does. I mean, there's plenty of indies. Defender's Quest was one who wrote a great article about he saw that he was kind of getting good sales in China. So I thought, well, I may as well localize to Chinese, then localized it and got huge booming sales from it. But you never really know where your game's going to hit sometimes, right? Especially with indies that can be so specific in terms of mechanics and things like that.
And yeah, so that's one thing is the mechanics. The other thing that's always interesting is localization is so much more than just translation. And we've been talking about languages, but there's China. When you think about some of the rules around, like, are undead enemies going to be considered disrespectful, and therefore you have to change it. Localizing for Germany, some kinds of violence or anything related to World War II, you can have huge problems with. So the localization can be for certain markets a much bigger problem. I mean, Command and Conquer Zero Hour is a great example where in Germany they had to replace a huge number of the units with robots just because it was considered too violent to be released there with humans. Yeah, and so that's a lot more work than typical. You're basically redoing all of the art assets to localize to Germany in that case, and that's going to be a very different cost benefit assessment than just changing the dialogue from English to German. So localization, what can often come up is those sort of curveballs where you think it's going to be easy, and then someone comes back and says, actually, this is, if you want to localize to this market, you're going to have to make a lot of changes, and here they are. And that's where I think having an experienced localizer is going to help some indies appreciate exactly what challenges they're going to run into and start thinking about that early on. Like if you think Germany is going to be a big market for you, but you're doing something World War II themed, you've got a problem. Like let's say it's some kind of strategy game that historically has been very popular, but you've got a World War II theme. You are now put on the horns of a dilemma. You either need a very different theme, or you need to realize your German version is going to look nothing like the version sold in the rest of Europe, due to the restrictions there about anything that's historically accurate in World War II. Display of certain things, even in a and we all know why I'm saying this. So those are the kind of localization challenges that some of them are really translation or just a little bit more in translation. Others can involve a really deep-seated rethink of core game elements, typically presentation, but occasionally even mechanics. Sometimes what's needed to localize is also changing the monetization strategy for mobile, for example. And so that's where you really have to. That's where publishers can be really helpful, because one of the things they've done is localize to different markets. And so if you have someone who's, say, specialized in strategy games and they've been selling strategy games around the world, they're going to be able to tell you this game plays well in these European countries, but not these others, or this one, because of the extra costs to go to Germany, is not worth it in our experience. So it's much like picking the price. The publisher is going to have a good idea of price point that you as a developer, you just don't have the same visibility on how different games tend to sell in your market. You may have some visibility, but if you're with a good publisher, they almost certainly have more visibility than you do.
Totally. And yeah, I absolutely agree. Yeah, everything you said is something we talk about a lot is about working with localizers who have people in country who really can understand the culture because you're absolutely right. The amount of like small nuances to different markets and what you are allowed and aren't allowed to say can be out of nowhere in some ways. So yeah,
Yeah,
definitely. And obviously with that, yeah, with Germany, some of the changes to Wolfenstein had to make were very famous, kind
yeah,
of online, lots of articles written about them, and it just showed how little people, even across the industry, knew about how major an effect those laws had on games being released there. People kind of thought it was a novelty, and it's like that's been the last 30 or more
yeah.
years that's been going on.
Yeah, and it's funny that those things aren't as well known as I think they should be. So, of course, the effects are a little uneven. Like some people, if you've got a match three platform game, it'd be pretty rare that anything related to say German localization laws are going to be a problem. But depending on what your genre is, the more realistic your game is, the less abstract it is. Say, the bigger the chance that it's going to be offensive to someone somewhere, or it's going to get run offside of some kind of law somewhere. Um, and then mobile, of course, like there's all the privacy implications for operating in Europe that are different from North America. And that was just because mobile tends to collect a lot more data than PC or console. And so you need to worry about that. It's not quite a localization issue in a traditional sense, but it's something you need to think about when you're entering those markets.
I wanted to ask a little bit as well about IP laws, because again, we're talking about this being different, and assignment and license being separate terms, but both incredibly important. And it's just something, obviously, I think an indie going into it, it's one of one of the most important legalese, at least from what I understood. So would you mind explaining just a little bit about the difference between those?
Totally. And I think you're right that in terms of legal terms of art, that you need to know what they mean as a developer. These are probably, as you said, the most important too. So assignment is really just a fancy legal word that means sale. So if I've assigned something to you, I've transferred that right. And it tends to be used to mean some sort of intangible right. Like we don't talk about assigning our car or a house. We do talk about assigning a lease or assigning intellectual property of different kinds. It really just means a sale or a transfer of some kind of intangible right. So if you assign your IP over, you don't own it anymore. You've given it to someone else. A classic example is, as I talked about, sort of like the more traditional development. I pay you to develop a game. You assign the IP to me. I now own it. You don't. So if you have a question, can I do something with the IP? The answer is no, because you don't own it. And if the person who's gotten the assignment has a question, can I do something with the IP? The answer is always yes, because they own it. So an assignment has the benefit of great clarity. The question of what can you do with something is always yes if you own it, and if you don't own it, it's always no. Then you come to, and you can think about if you assign a lease, you used to be the person who had the lease, you've assigned it over to someone else. Can you live in the apartment that you assigned the lease for? The answer is no. It's no longer your lease. And then by contrast, a license means just permission. And we've all seen end user license agreements. And those are very clear that, look, I'm giving you permission to install this software, to use this software, but you don't own it. Microsoft continues to own Word, even if they've licensed it to you. And so those are two ends of a spectrum, sort of license and assignment. But then you have this really important concept that sits somewhere in between called an exclusive license. And most indie publishing contracts are built on exclusive licenses, which the publisher says, look, you continue to own the IP, but you're going to license this to us on an exclusive basis. And then the publisher can go off and license it to users, to say platforms that then sell it to users, all of those things. But that word exclusive license, or the phrase exclusive license, the word exclusive is far more important than the word license. Because when you look at it practically, an exclusive license is much closer to an assignment, so transfer of ownership, than it is to the non-exclusive licenses that allow us to put software on our own devices. Because an exclusive license means you can't license it to anyone else, and you can't use it yourself. You've excluded the rest of the world. You've even excluded yourself from using your own IP other than in accordance with the license. So it's really like leasing your house. You continue to own your house if you lease it to someone, but you can't live there anymore. So yes, you have ownership of your house, but you can't do any of the things you normally do with a house, like live in it. And much like if you lease your house to someone, if they're renting your house and paying you rent, you want to make sure the amount they're paying you in rent makes it worthwhile to lease your house to them, because you can't live there anymore. So it would be a bad idea to rent your house to someone if you have to then go out and rent an apartment that costs more than the rent on your house. So an exclusive license is really almost giving away. It's true you own your IP, but you've given away all of the economic ownership rights you would normally have. You've given them to the publisher. The publisher is the one that's going to exploit them and then give you rev share in return. So yes, you own your IP, but in practice, the publisher is the only one who can do anything with it. So be very aware that when you exclusively license your IP, it had better be a good deal, because you're no longer able to use it yourself. And that's why there's all this, when we talked about the model, it's a lot closer to the traditional model than you'd think, because you can't go off and make another game. You can't go off and sell that game to another publisher unless you've terminated the contract somehow. You are linked to the publisher. And then that's also why they want those other rights on your sequels as well, because their license covers the first game. It wouldn't cover a sequel, and they want to make sure that if you do go off and do a sequel, that they have some sort of claim over that, or they want to be involved in that project or benefit from that project. So the ownership model was clearer. The whole yes, no answer, it's very clear when it's yes and when it's no. The question of can I do it with a license depends on the scope of the license. It really depends on the specific contract you've signed, what rights you've given over, what rights you've kept back. Sometimes the developer will say, I'm willing to give you the game rights, but I want to keep the merchandising rights, or we'll both have merchandising rights. And I've seen that sliced and diced different ways. It really depends if you think you have a game that lends itself to merchandising, plushies, board games, hoodies, whatever. But licenses are not as black and white, as sort of as stark a difference as you own it, you don't own it. They give you a lot more room to negotiate, which can be a good thing. You can come to a more nuanced deal in certain ways. And obviously, in exchange for the license, you're going to want rev share back. You're going to want to negotiate all of these aspects. But just be aware that the exclusive license is, for most practical intents and purposes, giving away your IP for the duration of the contract. And often that's where you want to pay close attention to how you get out of the contract and how long it lasts as a default. Typically, you'll see publishers asking 5 or 10 years. For most video games, 5 or 10 years is the entire commercial life of the game. Very few games make substantial sales 5 or 10 years later. There are exceptions, and there's obviously franchises where you've put out new games over that time. But to say that the same game is making large sales 5 or 10 years later, most games, that's just not the case. And that is an issue if, you'll get your rights back in 10 years, but what are you going to be able to do with them? Maybe if it's a really popular game, you re-release an HD remaster or something. But for most games, that's just not going to be that's a non-starter. So you have given your rights away from an economic sense, and you've done so for the entire commercial life of those rights. So you want to think very carefully about this. There is a meaningful distinction legally between assignment and exclusive license, but in practice, if you're doing an exclusive license, you've effectively assigned it away. Your ability to do stuff is going to, with your own IP, is so restricted, you should in your own mind be treating it almost like an assignment.
And with that, you mentioned remasters, and I hadn't really thought about this, but is are remasters now would that ever be built into a contract? Would a publisher say, we'll publish this game, but we want the exclusive rights to remaster it in X amount of time if we do?
So that's a good example where if there's things people haven't thought about in the contract, if there's been an ownership transfer, the answer is clear. The owner can do whatever they want. If there's no ownership transfer, everyone has to go back to the contract and look like, hey, what rights do I have? Typically, a broad exclusive license would give the publisher the right to release a remaster, just because they have the right to release the game, and it'll say like in any format on any platform, et cetera, et cetera. That would capture remasters. On the other hand, if the contract is quite narrowly defined in terms of the rights, it may be that there's a gap that would allow the developer to release a remaster. But I think a publisher would be quite angry at their lawyer if they'd left such a gap. So typically the publisher is the one who's going to do it, unless, as I say, the contract is expired. If 5 or 10 years later the contract is done and you want to go back and release a remaster, you've recaptured your IP. There's no license that would exclude you. You can do whatever you want. And I'd say most publishers are focused more on sequels than remasters, because they know that for most games, if it's successful, there'll be a sequel. There won't necessarily be a remaster. They're just less common. Some publishers do throw them in the list of sequels, expansions, prequels, remasters. I'd say typically, though, you tend to see more discussion of just sequels than remasters.
It's very interesting, hearing all this, because it makes you think about the cases we've had in the games industry where it was just blindly confusing, like when Max Payne 3 came out and it was not involved with Remedy at all, and you're going, well, what happened here? And I believe read an article that was saying they had that contract of they were allowed to make the sequel, but it had to be published by Rockstar. And then after that, Rockstar would buy the IP from them, which then led to Max Payne 3 being by them. And it's quite an interesting one to compare to other industries, because games are inherently creative, and it must be an odd feeling creating something, coming up with this idea and knowing that at some point you're going to have to lose your right to your creative idea.
Yeah, and that's why I think a lot of people get antsy about sequel clauses, particularly one that would allow the publisher to come out with a sequel without the original developer. Some really aggressive publishing contracts also talk about ports with zero involvement from the developer. And the developer may not have the resources to do a particular kind of port, but still they just get antsy about it. Because as you say, it's a creative process. It's their product. Nobody wants to have a bad quality port put out in their own name. It's frustrating for players, and no one wants to be associated with what they see as sort of a sub-quality product. So it's as you say, in a creative industry, it's a lot trickier to navigate these things because the original developer even if they're not involved in creating a particular version of their game, or let alone a sequel, will still feel like they have a stake in it, like their name is attached to that project, even if they're not showing up in the credits.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. Yeah. There's even some recently where you see the original directors or original producers coming out and kind of commenting publicly on it, which must also feel pretty bad to be the team that worked on the upper
Yeah.
remaster.
Well, and that's why I'd say it's rare that this happens. Like your example for Max Payne is a good one because it is not all that common, and I think one of the reasons is it's such an awkward position for everyone to be in. And you're sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't. As soon as you release something like that, stick too close to the original, you're accused of just sort of if not innovating. Why didn't you use the original developers if you're just going to remake their game with minor changes? You innovate too far. And it's the same thing with say some of the high profile re-releases that are coming out. I think Silent Hill 2 re-release, that's going to be a very tough line to navigate. Staying true to the original while still innovating, that's a contradiction in terms. It's really tough to get that right. It's doable, but very few people pull it off.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. Reticent of time, so I don't want to overkeep
Yeah,
you. So there's one thing that everyone wants to talk about is marketing. So it's the only question I'll ask is it always comes up. I was once at an event and literally in the middle of a game agent and three game developers, they were doing a talk about marketing, and literally an indie developer ran in the room with their hand in the air saying, "I've just got an email from my publisher and they say I've misunderstood the contract." And the response from the panel was, we would need to see your contract to comment. But in terms of the obligations and the trends of who typically is paying for it or whether the money's going to come out of the revenue post release and things like that, where does marketing sit and kind of has it changed at all?
so that's a really good point. So marketing is primarily the publisher's responsibility. That's one of the main things they bring to the table. Because in theory, you go to a bank and get a loan for the money you need to make the game, or just one of these investment funds. But the main thing that a traditional publisher or an indie publisher brings is not just money, because lots of people are willing to finance ventures, but it's also the marketing expertise, the connections with platform owners, knowing maybe connections with influencers, knowing how to market a game, knowing where the best place to spend marketing dollars are, there may be metrics and other data from past games. So marketing is one of the main things publishers bring to the table. One of the sort of ironic things, though, is that even if in the typical contract, you've got very detailed milestones for the developer. By this date, you will deliver this, we will review it, we will approve it. If we don't like it, you'll go back and redo it. When you get to marketing, the default approach for most publishers is, we'll take reasonable efforts. We'll do what we can. And I've even had publishers in negotiation sessions be like, no, I will not give any commitment to do anything. We'll just use reasonable efforts. We want to be able to use our judgment. We don't want anyone second guessing us. And that contrast between very detailed lists of what developers need to do and often incredibly vague obligations for the publisher can be really frustrating for a lot of developers, because their point is, if one of your top two things is marketing my game, I want to know what you're going to do. Give me some visibility, give me a commitment. And so that's one issue where most publishers, the draft that comes over is going to be quite vague. And you can understand sometimes that they want to be able to react on changing market conditions. But at the other hand, I think it's legitimate to at least have a marketing plan, to share that with the developer, and to say that you'll stick more or less to the plan unless things change or you both agree that the plan needs to change. So the typical clause, the starting point is basically no commitment of any kind. The next step you can go to is some kind of marketing plan that will be either attached to the game, attached to the contract, or developed within 30 days of signature or at some milestone in the game's development process, and you'll stick to the plan. Next thing that I often try to ask for and can get a reasonable amount of the time is a minimum marketing budget, which is to say you will spend at least this much money on the game. And that's fair because pretty often the publisher will have shared a marketing budget with the developers. So you just take that number and you put in the contract and say, like, you can't just back out and not market my game. And we often see like great games that for whatever reason are released with very little fanfare, don't get the marketing support they need. And so they remain cult classics, but they're never the broader success that they could have been. So that's something I ask for. And I can't say that I get it all the time when I'm representing the developer, but I usually try. And the other thing is try and, without micromanaging how that's spent, try to make sure that money's spent around the release date, just so that if it's a 5 or 10 year contract, the publisher can't delay publishing or delay investing in marketing until a point where they're able to either terminate the contract or you, the developer, aren't interested anymore. So that's one piece. The other thing is occasionally if you do pick a publisher as the developer because they have, say, connections with Nintendo and you want to be highlighted in the Nintendo Switch store, and that's the main reason you're going with this publisher, put that in the contract. Like, just insist on that. If you really are picking a specific publisher for specific marketing, then what you really need to do is make very clear that you are doing that in the contract, and that their obligations appear in the contract. And that, you'd be surprised how often that's a motivation for picking a publisher, and yet the contract is silent on that point. So you may get pushback, and if you get that pushback, you want to explore why. It's like, oh, you don't want to put in the contract. Why is that? In our like offline discussions, non-legal, you told me that you could get me in front of this particular platform owner, or you could be featured on this. Why aren't you willing to put that in writing? And that's always a tough conversation, but it's a necessary one, because if that's the reason you're picking that publisher and they're not willing to commit to it, you should have questions about why they're not willing to commit. And I'd say this is one of the areas where there's a lot of pushback, that typically you'll ask for a bunch of things as a developer, and then you'll get some level of pushback. Sometimes publishers will offer some of the things we've talked about. Rarely will they offer all of them. And then, of course, these costs are almost always recoupable, in the sense that if, just as when the publisher is going to spend money on to make the game and then earn it back, typically the marketing budget will go into the same recoupment pot. One thing I've seen from some publishers is that marketing costs are sometimes only partially recoupable, in the sense that they may say, look, we'll put in $100,000 on marketing, half of that will be recoupable, half of it will not. That's obviously great for the developer, because it means that more of the money is being borne by the publisher. They'll see money earlier on the development side. Sometimes you see a marketing minimum, but also a maximum that says you can recoup up to the maximum. If you want to spend beyond that, go for it. But either you only recoup half of that or you recoup none of it. I've seen that done in various ways. I think for the developer, the best thing is to have a plan and a minimum marketing commitment with a little bit of detail around how that minimum commitment is spent. Because honestly, if that's one of the main reasons you go into a publisher, they're going to be very detailed for your obligations. You can expect some level of detail for theirs. And I think that's fair to both players, just so expectations are being set in a reasonable manner.
Yeah, definitely. It's exactly what you were saying earlier on about reflecting it back and making everything in writing. Absolutely. And it's incredibly important, right, for indies, because it's you see more and more of how hard it is to stand out. And I guess as the indie space
Yeah,
grows, especially on Steam, if that's where you're primarily releasing, a lot of people talking about poor visibility.
I agree. Discoverability is, I think, for a lot of indies, their biggest challenge. And that's one of the attractions of a publisher. Someone says, you may have a great game, but there's a lot of people putting great games on Steam. To make it stand out, unless you get very lucky and say a really well-known influencer plays your game, and then that gives you a sort of a platform to then become well-earned. And this is, again, discoverability is often a question of the snowball effect, that if you're known, you'll be put on the algorithm, you'll be promoted, and people will buy your game, so you're known, so you'll be pushed higher up the algorithm. And it can be a spiral either way. It can be a spiral up or spiral down, but it's one that you need that initial momentum. And if you can't get it, you're likely to stay off of front pages, special offers, algorithmic recommendations. So getting that initial push, that initial impetus from a publisher can be incredibly important. And that's why it makes sense to use a publisher, not just sort of try to find a bank that'll finance you. Is you may need help with discoverability, and the person who's going to help you is probably going to be a traditional publisher. A publisher in the sense of like either, I don't mean traditional, like not indie, but a video game publisher rather than like an investment fund.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, and definitely. I mean, that's a great point to end on, I think, because it's just we've covered a lot, and that's a lovely end point. Thank you so much for joining us today, Michael. It's been absolutely fascinating.
Hey, thank you for having me, Connell. It's a pleasure.
No, genuinely, I think it's going to be incredibly insightful, and it's something that a lot of people don't have any insight into. I know it's very hard to find out. Your original talk was one of the ways that I was able to actually try understand a little bit more of it, and to think of I think it's almost deceptive in the industry as well, because as you say, not being able
Mhm.
to see that as a
Mhm.
comparison and have someone like yourself have these opinions and insights into it is just irreplaceable. So thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. Hopefully, we'll do this again one day.
Absolutely. Well, this is it. Next time we need to talk about some of the legalities of loot boxes, which I saw was listed, and would love to pick your brain on.
Yeah, that's a very hot topic in North America, and that would be equally interesting. So yeah, until
Fantastic.
next
Yeah,
time.
until then. Perfect. And that was our interview with Michael Shortt. Huge thanks to Michael for joining us and sharing his insights, and a massive thanks to you for watching. I really hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed doing the interview. Keep an eye on ECI Games, as throughout the rest of the year and ongoing, we're going to be interviewing amazing people from the industry and just discovering these really intriguing areas that often aren't as discussed as others. Keep an eye as well on our Twitter at ECI Games, where we'll be sharing updates on our podcast, APAC Games Weekly, as well as our new podcast, Indie Views. And just to finish, as mentioned in part one, all opinions shared during the interview are those of the individuals and do not represent our respective companies. Thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you on the next one.